You're listening to Think in Translation, a literary podcast from Vagabond Voices in Glasgow. The series is made up of conversations with international authors, translators, publishers, and booksellers with the aim of making translated books more accessible. Episodes air every second Thursday. This week's guest is Matthew Hyde. He is a translator of Estonian and Russian literature, and he's on an interesting journey to literary translation, which he's going to talk about a little bit here. He also discusses what is overlooked when we think about translations and the links between translating fiction and creating music.
My name is Matthew Hyde, and I'm a translator from Estonian and Russian. I've been doing that now for about 4 years. That is, I've been doing literary translation for about 4 years. And I've translated one book already for Vagabond Voices, which was Rain Raud's Death of the Perfect Sentence. That was from Estonian. I'm now working on a book from Russian by a writer called Andrei Ivanov. The book's called Hanuman's Journey to Lolland, and that's also going to be published by Vagabond Voices this year. I started as a translator a long time ago, but it wasn't literary translation. I had studied Russian at university in the early 90s, the first half of the 90s, and after graduating, I wanted a way to use my Russian, but I also wanted to be able to earn myself a living and to start a career in the UK. So I actually started working for GCHQ, and the kind of translation I was doing there was obviously not very literary. It was quite technical, quite related to military industrial topics, but I can't obviously go into too much detail about that. I only actually lasted there 2 years, and then my career took me in a different direction. I joined the Foreign Office, I became a diplomat, and I worked in London, Moscow and Estonia. And it wasn't until actually I left that job, which was 5 years ago now, that I started learning Estonian, and then I started translating Estonian literature really as a way of learning more about this country, which has become my new homeland. It's a while since I've read myself anything that's been translated. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, obviously, if you're a native speaker of English, and also if you speak Russian, that gives you a huge amount that you can actually read in the original without it being translated. But the other thing I've found that since I've been a literary translator is that when I start reading something that's translated, I find it hard not to read it with a slightly critical eye and kind of find ways in which slight improvements can be made or something, because the cliche is that a translation is never finished. So even when something's been published, there might still be some kind of tiny wrinkles in English which could have been smoothed out. I'm going to mention a book which actually wasn't translated, but it could have been translated. And the reason is that it was written by a guy called Alexander Hemon, who is a writer originally from Bosnia, but he moved to the States in the early 90s and he started writing in English. So he's writing in English, which isn't his mother tongue. Why it's interesting to a translator is that it actually gives you an idea of how flexible English can be, and also even if the English contains it sounds slightly foreign in places. Actually, it shows you as a translator that perhaps a little bit of foreignness is acceptable in your finished product in the English, even though obviously one of our main objectives is to produce a translation which sounds like it could have been written in English. Still, if you see a writer who's writing in English and it's not their native language, that can really open up your perspective as to the flexibility of English. And the writer, Alexander Hemon, is absolutely wonderful, because you get a feeling of him actually playing with the language and almost discovering the language in the process of writing, actually taking some sort of delight from exploring it. We want to produce translations which sound like they could almost have been written in English in the original, but that's actually, in a sense, it's an impossible task, because the reader's always going to know they're reading a translation. They're going to see that the writer came from a different country, has got a foreign name, etc. And there's always going to be, I think, an element of foreignness still within the translation. And if you can bring something new, perhaps something colourful, something slightly different to English, import something into English from a foreign language in a way which still will lead to a smooth English, which isn't going to kind of bother the reader too much, I think that's really a powerful thing that you can do as a translator. Obviously, the language can benefit, but in general, our culture as well. If you look at the way in which English literature has developed, English writers have always been influenced by foreign writers, many of whom they've read in translation, not in the original. Because if you only read literature in the original, then you're generally going to be quite limited, to who you can read, unless you're kind of a polyglot. So yeah, our writers, our literary culture in the UK has been very much influenced by literature in translation. Obviously, Estonian and English are very different languages. For example, Estonian doesn't have a future tense in the same way that English does. It will often use like the present continuous instead. That can lead to some kind of ambiguity. But I think these problems come up with all languages and always come up with translation. And I mean, that's the task of the translator to find a way around these differences. I mean, there's always been this debate about is it true that, is it the case that some things are not translatable? I think text literature is always translatable. You just have to find the right way of doing it. I think translation is very important as a means of learning about the rest of the world and about other countries and other peoples. And I think in the age we're living in now, with the Brexit referendum in the UK and Trump in the US, it does seem to be a tendency for countries to become more insular and turn in on themselves, and a tendency to perhaps view the foreigner, the outsider, as a threat in some way, or to be blamed in some way for our domestic problems in the way in which the EU has been blamed. And translation is obviously vital in this environment, so that people can continue to learn about other countries, other people around the world, and discover that they are different in some ways, but ultimately very similar as well. It's hard maybe for me to say, because I haven't been involved in literary translation for that long, only the last 4 years really. But it's good to see that there are now these literary awards where the prize is being given jointly to the author and the translator, as in the case of the Man Book International, and also the new European Bank for Reconstruction and Development Literary Award, where the prize is shared again between the translator and the writer. So there does seem to be recognition, at quite a high level, that the translator plays a very important role. The other side, though, to this is that I get the feeling that still there isn't really much understanding of what translators actually do, and not just amongst as it were lay people, but even amongst people in the UK, for example, who have studied languages or who read literature, or even who read literature and translation. They don't really have much idea of what a translator does, and I think there's been a failure on the part of translators to talk about themselves. I'd like to see more articles in newspapers or literary journals where translators are perhaps explaining what they do a bit more. There seems to be a lot of ignorance about it. I do think that people tend to see translation as basically just swapping words around. You're basically just like a dictionary, and that every word in one language has a direct equivalent in the other language, and that's just not the case. Languages are very different to one another, and there's always going to be very many different ways of translating just one sentence. If you give a piece of text to 10 different literary translators, you will get 10 different translations. And really what the translator has to do, he has to inhabit the mental world of the writer to fully understand what the writer was trying to achieve in the original language, what he was trying to express, what he was feeling, what he was seeing, and then to put that into English, to express that in English, in a language which is very different to the original language, which gives you different possibilities for creative expression. So there's far more, I think, going on there than people might realise from the outside. I mean, I think people like to think when they read literature in translation that they have a kind of a direct, unmediated kind of route to the original and to the writer, but that's not the case. I mean, it's what you're reading is actually the text the English that's been written by the translator, even though obviously it's based very, very closely on what the original writer has written. It's still the translator's text. You're experiencing the language that the translator has written. One of the things I've been thinking about is that in the UK in particular, translators tend to be obviously people with language degrees, primarily linguists who've studied languages. It seems to me that often literary translators haven't actually studied literature formally. And speaking for myself, the more I translate, the more I realise actually I should be reading a lot more in English, English literature, because that gives you a much deeper insight into the possibilities of your own language, which you're not really going to be able to explore as well otherwise. Ultimately, as a literary translator, you do have to be able to write. You have to understand the original. That's very, very important. You couldn't do it without that. But then you have to actually be able to turn that into literary English, the kind of English which a writer would write in English. And, to do that, you really have to read a lot of English literature in the original. And I think that is it seems that sometimes has been neglected, I think, when we're looking at the way in which literary translators are trained. There's more of a focus on language studies. I don't want to speak too kind of generally. I don't I don't know that many other literary translators, but I just I have the feeling that sometimes there's been more focus in terms of their educational background on learning languages rather than reading literature, studying literature, and writing in English. People are talking about machine translation quite a lot and Google Translate, and in some ways I actually find it quite heartening that I'm involved in a profession or creative practice that actually still seems fairly immune to automation, because at least in terms of literary translation, I don't think Google Translate and other machine translation tools are really anywhere near being ready to do that yet. And I think the reason for that, I mean, obviously it's again quite a large subject, but the reason for that is that ultimately literary style is quite unpredictable. Obviously, writers are always finding new ways of expressing themselves and new ways to use language. Now, computers, when they translate, tend to the system they use is to compare the text they're translating against databases of similar texts or similar words and phrases that have already been translated. So computers are always going to be tripped up by ways in which the writer has used the language in original and unexpected ways. So I can't see computers being used to do literary translation for some time yet, even though I'd never say never. It might eventually happen. Humans aren't binary like computers, and human expression is far more subtle and complex than that. And ultimately, language, literature is a very human thing, which I think computers aren't actually able to understand it or feel it, because they're not human. It was about 5 years ago that I left my job in the Foreign Office. I was working in the embassy here in Tallinn, and that's when I started properly learning Estonian, and when I started properly studying the double bass and practicing, and these two things have kind of developed side by side. So when I started writing jazz music, then it seemed natural that the titles of the compositions, for example, were Estonian. They just seemed to kind of spring up from my life in Estonia, and I found out actually quite hard to give them English titles. I mean, there certainly are very many similarities between music and language. It's maybe quite a big subject to get into now, but I think one thing that I've noticed is this question of rhythm and pace when you're writing. That's very important in literature, I think, and that's something which obviously is really central to music as well. I think one of the things that excites me about translation is giving a voice to other people, to other cultures that maybe otherwise wouldn't be noticed in the English-speaking world. And as far as Estonia is concerned, then to be honest, not that many people outside of Estonia or in the UK in particular actually know that much about Estonia, about its history and its culture. And so you're involved in an important form of cultural diplomacy, really, that helps to tell the rest of the world about this country. But that actually raises an interesting question: is as a translator, what do you choose to tell, or what stories do you choose to bring across, and which writers do you translate, and which parts of the culture, the history do you want to highlight? And there can be a tendency for there perhaps to be a kind of accepted mainstream view of what Estonia is. Maybe it's connected to this idea of kind of country branding and how the country wants to project itself to the outside world. But there may be other, even within Estonia, there may be other hidden stories that people aren't going to know about. One interesting thing about Estonia is that there's a Russian minority here, and one of the writers I'm translating, Andrei Ivanov, is a Russian Estonian, and in a mainstream Estonian culture, perhaps there isn't so much known about that side of Estonian culture. So I think you can have a role as a translator to bring these stories into the open and help to communicate them to the rest of the world.
Thanks for listening to Think in Translation. The show is made possible by the support of the Space and Creative Scotland. For more information about Vagabond Voices and Think in Translation, including blog posts exploring translation from various angles, visit vagabondvoices.co.uk. Our music, with Mezza, is written and performed by Matthew Hyde, yes, that Matthew Hyde, and his quintet. The show is produced and edited by Alex Block.